The church ledger in Hollow Creek began in 1781, bound in deer hide and inked by careful hands. Every birth was listed, every baptism marked with a curled symbol of grace, and every death closed with a final stroke in black. No child was missed, no name left out, except the firstborn sons of the Benton family. Starting in 1822, a strange pattern began and no one noticed at first. The names simply stopped appearing, not once, not suddenly, but over time like drops of ink quietly lifted from the page. The clerk would reach the Benton line, hesitate and move on. No scribble, no date, just absence that deepened like a bruise across the decades. The first to question it was Reverend Miles, who arrived in Hollow Creek in 1849 with bright eyes and a sharpened quill. He found the church quiet, the congregation polite, and the records mostly in order, until he traced the lineage of Claudine Benton and found no mention of her first child. She was a widow by then, soft-voiced and neatly dressed, always seated in the second pew, always alone. When asked, she smiled and said, "That child was never meant for records." Reverend Miles didn't press her. A week later, his hands were blistered from the font water, though the basin held no heat. He stopped asking after that. Over the next 30 years, 5 more firstborn sons from the Benton line would go unrecorded. Their mothers arrived to service with bowed heads and hollow eyes, holding nothing. No christening, no funeral, no trace. Neighbors whispered, but did not knock. Each time the second child would arrive within a year, always a girl or a boy not born first, and be welcomed with song, water, and oil. Only then would the record resume as though nothing had gone missing. By 1870, the ledger showed a sharp rhythm. Name, date, name, blank. Name, date, name, blank. It grew hard to ignore. Someone began crossing through the skipped lines in pencil, but even that faded over time, as if the paper itself resisted being told the truth. One clerk, young and unshaven, wrote a note in the margin. First sons not entered, no request made, no child seen. The note was torn out 2 days later, leaving only a jagged edge beside a child's unmarked space. It was not until the courthouse caught fire in 1883 that the church was asked to provide copies of all birth ledgers for the county. The Bentons refused permission for their line. A lawyer came down from Knoxville to dispute it. He was found asleep at the base of the altar, clutching a page that had never been inked. He left town that afternoon without his coat or shoes. Even as times changed, as cameras arrived and doctors kept their own forms, the Benton family maintained a silent gap where the firstborn boys should have been. Nurses were dismissed within hours of labor. Midwives were chosen from far counties and never invited back. The children who did survive, always second or third born, bore no memory of their older brothers. They were not spoken of. They were not mourned. And yet the earth in the Benton orchard shifted every decade, just enough to show a new mound before the grass grew even again. A mound with no stone, no marker, but always in the same line. Parallel, measured, intentional. When asked, the caretaker would only say, "That family buries quiet," and the town accepted it because by then no one wanted to know what they'd agreed to forget. The church still holds the ledger today. The deer hide is brittle, the ink faded in places. But if you run your hand over the early pages, you'll feel the blank lines like a scar. The names that were never written, the lives never spoken, and the year it all began, 1822, when something inside the Benton house decided that the firstborn son belonged to no one but them. Claudine Benton did not wear black to her husband's funeral. She wore white linen stitched with ivory thread, pale gloves pulled high above her wrists, and a thin silver pin in her collar that looked like a drop of frozen milk. The town thought it was grief that had left her quiet. But grief does not keep a woman smiling. Grief does not make her speak in even tones, pour tea for the pastor, or lay out biscuits shaped like moons 2 hours after the grave was filled. She never touched the casket, never kissed his forehead. When asked if she needed anything, she said no, then offered more sugar cubes. Her eyes didn't dart, her hands didn't shake. And when she walked home alone that evening, her shoes left no drag in the mud. The house she returned to was too clean. No sign of mourning, no mirrors covered, no drapes drawn. In fact, the windows were open. Wind moved through the halls like something invited. Claudine made a fire. She boiled milk. Then she pulled a small lockbox from beneath her sewing chair and set it on the table. Inside were 5 cloth bundles, each wrapped with careful knots, each stained at the center with something pale yellow and soft as dried wax. She unwrapped only one and pressed her fingers to the flattened fabric inside. A child's cloth cap, a christening bonnet never worn. She folded it again and placed it back without a sound. Her first son had died in 1822. That much was known. What wasn't known, what was never spoken aloud, was that no one had seen him beyond the 3rd night. The midwife who delivered him left early, stomach turned and face pale, muttering about how the child hadn't cried. Claudine explained it later as a stillbirth, but no one saw the body. The grave in the orchard was dug by her husband, then covered again before dawn. Claudine didn't attend. She stayed indoors, humming low and heating a spoon in candle wax for what she called cleaning the air. After that, the routine was quiet, predictable. Whenever a child was born in the house, Claudine would ask one thing: no visitors for 3 days. If the child made it past the 3rd, it was introduced. If not, the house would smell of vinegar and clove for a full week, and the next Benton birth would come a year later, always missing its older brother. She never explained her rule, only enforced it. No child cried in her house past their 3rd day. Those were her exact words to the maid once, who heard it and never returned. Another girl stayed longer and reported strange patterns in the crib linens. Threads tied in knots of 3, pillows sewn with flax seeds and ash, even a silver ring stitched into the base of the mattress. Claudine would place a mirror beside the infant's head each night, but not to see its breath. She would watch the reflection and tilt her head, as though waiting for something not born of skin to make itself known. It was not rage that moved her, not loss. It was method, ritual, measured care. She believed something about the first breath, that it took more than air, that it could call attention from things better left beyond the wall. And so she made sure it never happened again. Firstborn sons were too loud, she said once to the Reverend's wife. The silence they left behind was cleaner, less likely to echo. Her second son, Joseph, was raised like porcelain, never scolded, never hit. She brushed his hair exactly 100 times each night. She kept a bird in the nursery cage, not to sing, but to watch. If the bird pecked once at the mirror, Claudine would carry it out and snap its neck before the child woke. No crying, no breaking the rule. By the time she was 50, she had buried 2 husbands and 5 firstborn sons. None were ever registered, none baptized, and no Benton child ever cried past dawn on their 3rd day again. The local doctor stopped asking. The midwives stopped coming. Claudine became a figure of quiet power, not feared, not loved, but obeyed. She wore white every Sunday and walked without a cane. The church kept her pew empty when she was late. The children were told not to look her in the eye, and still she smiled. Always the same soft, strange smile. The kind a person gives when they've seen something they can't unsee and decided to live beside it, not against it. The first was named Margaret Bess, and in 1822 she was 31, thick-wristed, God-fearing, and trusted by every woman from Hollow Creek to Miller's Field. She had delivered 64 infants without a single death. Then she was called to the Benton home. Claudine was already in labor when Margaret arrived, her breath shallow but steady, the linens folded too neatly for a house in pain. Claudine barely winced, barely moved, and when the child slipped into the world, Margaret thought she'd witnessed a miracle. No tears, no blood where there should have been. The boy was whole, eyes wide open, not a single blemish on his skin. But there was no cry, just silence, not the gasping kind, not the kind that signals a struggle. He was breathing, just not making a sound. Claudine looked down and said, "He won't be loud." "He understands," Margaret reached for the basin to clean him, but the water was cold, too cold. It had been warm minutes before, fresh from the kettle. Now it steamed nothing. Her hands trembled when they touched the surface. It felt like glass. She turned to ask for fresh water and found Claudine already holding a small cloth embroidered with 3 black knots. "I'll finish," the widow said. Margaret was sent home before dawn. When she returned a week later to check in, she found no crib, no child, no trace of birth. Only lavender oil on the floorboards and a white ribbon nailed to the door. The second was Naomi Riddell. She was younger, sharper, unmarried, and less obedient to custom. She came in 1837, called in place of the town doctor who had mysteriously declined the case. Naomi entered the house and immediately felt wrong. The air was too still. There were no animals, no ticking clock, no dust. Claudine was not alone. There were 2 other women there, silent and dressed in gray. They did not speak, only pressed herbs into Naomi's palm and pointed her toward the birthing room. The boy arrived fast, too fast, as though the body had already decided it was time. He came out clean like he had never been inside anyone. Naomi checked him for breath and saw his chest rise slow and even. But no cry. She rubbed his back, flicked the soles of his feet, even pinched him gently. Nothing. Then Claudine leaned in and whispered to the infant, "He's not meant for light." Naomi froze. The voice had not changed tone. It wasn't grief or fear or madness. It was instruction, like someone confirming a schedule. The 2 women in gray stepped forward. One carried a jar. The other carried a spoon. Naomi was told to leave before she could ask what was in either. She left her apron behind and later claimed the house made her dream of soot in her throat for 3 nights straight. She never delivered again. The third was Ruth Mary Elkins, called to the Benton home in 1865 when most of the old names had died or moved away. Ruth was not a midwife by profession, but had trained during the war when proper nurses were scarce. She came because no one else would. The Benton house was unchanged, same white fence, same garden with no vegetables, same odd chill that pressed against the lungs but never made you cough. Claudine was older, quiet, polite. She had laid out towels, boiled water, opened the windows. Ruth noted that the cradle beside the bed was built not of wood, but iron. Welded, bolted, padded with lamb's wool and stitched velvet. When she asked why, Claudine only said, "It keeps things from crossing." The labor was smooth, the child was flawless. And again, no cry. This time, Ruth insisted on staying until morning. She sat in a chair beside the cradle and tried to remain awake. At some point near dawn, she must have dozed. She swore the child had been alive when her eyes shut. When she opened them, Claudine was gone, and the cradle was empty. No child. No blood. Not even warmth on the pillow. She followed a trail of salt down the hallway leading to the root cellar, but the door was locked. Claudine returned an hour later, holding a jar of dried berries and smiling like nothing had passed. All 3 women gave sworn testimony at different points in their lives, though never in court. One wrote it in a letter. Another confessed it to her pastor. The last spoke it aloud in a convalescent ward just before her lungs gave out. Each described the same feeling, Not horror, not violence, but a kind of quiet removal, like watching something holy be undone in reverse. They did not speak of murder, they spoke of method. Each said the boy had lived. Each said the boy had not cried. Each was certain that the child had been made silent, not by neglect, but by something chosen, something ancient, something that Claudine had been taught and then perfected. The Benton barn stood like any other, gray-timbered and narrow, its roof sloped under decades of moss and stillness. But behind it, tucked beneath the shadow of an overgrown elm, was a smaller structure no one mistook for ordinary. It had once been called a smokehouse, though no one ever saw smoke rise from its chimney and no animal ever came near it. The townsfolk said it was for salted meat, for drying herbs, for pickling. But it was never opened during the fall hunts. No hams were hung from the rafters, no barrels wheeled in. Instead, a sharp, bitter smell leaked from its cracks, something not like rot but not like life either. It stung the nose and stayed on clothes, and those who got too close often reported a headache that crawled behind the eyes and stayed for days. Inside, when the door was finally forced open after Claudine's death, the sheriff and his men expected dust and string. What they found instead was something colder, tighter, and impossibly clean. The walls were lined with shelves, each shelf divided into narrow drawers, all made of red cedar polished to a shine that didn't belong in a barn. There were no flies, no signs of decay. Each drawer had a brass pull, and each one was labeled, not with names but with dates. Not full dates either, only months and years. March 1822, April 1837, September 1865. The pattern was clear to those who remembered the rumors. Each one aligned with the births that had gone unrecorded, with the sons that had never been baptized, with the 3-day silences that haunted the Benton name. The sheriff opened the first drawer with gloved hands. Inside was a child's linen wrap, perfectly folded, and a glass jar sealed with black wax. The wax had been stamped with a ring, 3 dots in a triangle, the same mark found stitched into the base of the Benton cradle. Inside the jar was a solution of thick, clear fluid, and inside that, a preserved object no bigger than a doll's head. It had lips, eyelids, lashes that floated gently against the glass. The body was curled, fetal, intact. There was no rot, no clouding. Just perfect suspended stillness. The next drawer held the same, and the next, and the next. 17 in total. 17 infants preserved in wax-sealed glass, each resting in its own drawer undisturbed for decades. The fluid was identified later as a mix of formalin, spirits, and something not easily traced, perhaps camphor or honeyed ash. The jars had been sealed with heat, not pressure, and each label inside listed not a name but a word in Latin. The same word repeated: reductus, reduced, lowered, returned. Not one had a birth certificate, not one had been seen by a doctor. Each child had been removed from record, suspended not in burial but in storage. A practice not of mourning but of control. Claudine had not grieved her sons. She had kept them, not hidden but organized. Preserved like specimens, not children. This was not madness. This was not chaos. It was method, precise, rehearsed, ritualized. She had learned how to measure the formalin, how to sterilize the glass, how to seal without fracture. The jars had not cracked even through decades of frost and thaw. She had planned for permanence. Some believed she thought they might return, that they were not dead but in pause. Others believed she was guarding them from something worse, keeping them out of reach of some ancient pull. But no one could explain the inscriptions carved into the inside of the drawers. 3 lines each, etched in a dialect that even scholars couldn't trace fully. The symbols matched nothing in scripture, nothing in medicine. But they repeated again and again beneath each child. Light confuses, warmth erases, keep beneath. What terrified the investigators most was not the horror of it, but the calmness. There was no frenzy, no mess. Only rows of drawers, each closed with care, each marked with a memory no one dared speak aloud. Claudine had visited that smokehouse once a year on the same day, bringing with her a tin box and a lit candle. No one followed. No one asked. The townsfolk accepted it as her private mourning, too polite or too afraid to question what she kept behind the barn. By the time the jars were removed, 3 had gone dry. The contents shriveled, darkened, shrunk. But the rest remained untouched, the bodies intact. And still, not one of them was ever claimed by a name. Not by family, not by God. Her name was Elsie Dunlow, but the Bentons called her the Girl. She was 17 when she was taken in as a nursemaid during the winter of 1869. Claudine had grown older by then, slower in the hands but sharper in the eyes, and her second daughter had just given birth to a boy. The girl was brought in to care for him, not as a servant, but as a stand-in for the mother, who had been sent away for reasons no one explained. Elsie was quiet, obedient, good with children. She took to the house like soft rain takes to dry wood, without sound, without push. For the first 2 days, she rocked the child, fed him goat's milk, warmed him by the hearth. He was calm, but his silence unsettled her. He blinked often, but never cried, never fussed, never clenched his fists. On the 3rd day, she heard Claudine humming behind the nursery door. The tune was not sweet. It had no rise, no fall. Just one note, stretched too long. That night, Elsie wrote a letter to her sister in town. The paper was torn from a ledger book, her handwriting quick and pressed too hard. She said the house was wrong. She said the cradle was not made of wood, but of iron welded at the corners with symbols carved beneath the mattress in a circle she hadn't noticed until the child stopped blinking and stared straight at them. She said the lullaby wasn't sung, but played on something behind the wall. A metal box with strings that moved on their own when Claudine touched the wall's seam with her palm. Elsie said she didn't believe in curses, but something in that house wasn't natural. She wrote, "I watched the shadow of the child stretch too long on the floor even though the candle was still." In the final paragraph, she said Claudine had brought in a knife. Not to harm, not in violence, but in ritual. It was thin, curved with a bone handle etched in copper wire. Claudine lit no candles, she poured no oils. She simply held the child in one arm and in the other traced the floor beneath them with ash. She placed the blade beside the baby's cheek and whispered, "He must not carry the shadow." Then she lowered the knife to the floor and dragged it slowly along the child's outline, not touching skin but slicing air as though trying to cut something unseen. The room grew cold. The cradle creaked, though nothing moved. Elsie watched from the door, breath caught, unable to step forward. Claudine looked up and said, "If he keeps it, it will scream." Elsie's letter was never mailed. It was found folded beneath her cot, discovered days after she vanished. No carriage tracks were seen. No bags were missing. She had simply stopped being in the house. Claudine told the sheriff she had dismissed the girl for negligence, that she'd found Elsie outside the nursery door without permission, listening where she shouldn't. No report was filed. The sheriff did not ask further questions. The Bentons were known. Their privacy was respected. The letter was tucked into the church's forgotten file box, never entered into public record. A year later, a traveling inspector from the county orphan registry came through Hollow Creek. He had been following up on an inquiry about Elsie's disappearance, filed anonymously by someone outside the family. The inspector visited the Benton house and was allowed in without resistance. Claudine served tea. She answered every question calmly, pointed to a set of employment documents signed with Elsie's name, and offered the inspector a tour of the nursery. The room had changed. No crib, no toys, only a desk with 2 drawers. The inspector returned to town and gave a full report. Nothing suspicious. 3 months later, he hanged himself in a boarding house outside Knoxville. In his coat pocket was a drawing scratched on the back of a prayer pamphlet, a curved blade crossing the silhouette of a child. Those who later studied Elsie's letter found references that did not match any known ritual. Cutting a shadow was not Christian, not pagan, not tribal. It was something else, something unique, something that required a child be silent and untouched by light for 3 days, and then permanently severed from his own shape. The knife, the ash, the music, it was not a killing. It was a practice, a belief that the human form was not whole unless it had been separated from what followed it. A belief that some boys were born with shadows too loud to survive. They found the trunks during the county's last property audit when the Benton estate was finally unsealed after the last living heir died without will or witness. The house had remained untouched for over 40 years, locked under court order, slowly hollowing into itself while vines crawled up the porch and the shutters collapsed in rot. But the trunks were preserved, 3 of them wrapped in heavy oilcloth, stacked side by side in the attic beneath the gabled peak. There was no dust on them, no mildew. The cloth still smelled faintly of beeswax and lavender, as if someone had sealed them only weeks before. When pried open, they revealed something so neat, so deliberate, it stopped the room cold. Inside were baptismal suits, dozens of them, folded with the kind of care reserved for relics or saints. Each suit was identical. Pale cream linen, tiny brass buttons, soft collars, hand-stitched initials on the cuffs. But no full names, just the letter B, repeated again and again. Each outfit was wrapped in tissue lined with pressed flowers, mostly bluebells and dried yarrow, both known for warding off grief. Each suit was marked with a date, month and year only. They matched the dates that never appeared in the church ledger. The same months the Benton Firstborns disappeared before the 4th day. There were no shoes, no caps, no stains. None of the fabric showed signs of wear. Not a thread out of place. It was clear they had never been used, never even held against skin. These were not garments made to be worn. They were made to remain untouched, unused, undisturbed. The suits for the girls were different. Those were found in a cedar chest downstairs, worn, soiled, repaired with love. Some still bore milk stains and tears at the seams from being passed down. Every girl in the Benton family had her baptism, her photo, her place in the records. But the boys had none. Their garments were never lifted from their trunks. What was more disturbing than their preservation was the presence of a note in each box, a slip of thick paper folded once, pinned beneath the lowest layer. The same phrase repeated over and over in faded ink. To dress. Him is to bind him no name, no signature, no explanation. Investigators initially assumed it was religious, maybe cultic, but no denomination recognized the phrase. It was not biblical, not apocryphal, not pagan. It seemed instead to be a rule, one made not by faith but by fear. Something the Bentons believed without needing to explain. Down in the cellar, behind a sealed wall later removed by court order, they found remnants of what might have been burial cloths. But not full shrouds, just corner scraps, all boys' sizes. Each piece was scorched at the edge and folded into a triangle as though meant to hold something small and soft. No full bodies were recovered, only soil samples beneath the orchard, and even those showed signs of unnatural chemical saturation. Formalin, bleach, lye, and something unidentifiable that hardened clay like fired brick. These boys were not buried, they were removed. The townspeople remembered the white ribbons tied to the front porch rails once a year. Some thought they were for prayer. Others thought they marked births or deaths. But no one remembered seeing the infants, just the ribbons, always white, always tied by Claudine herself before dawn. Some said she sang as she tied them. Others claimed she never looked up. But everyone remembered the quiet that followed, a stillness that felt deeper than grief, like a silence trying to hold something back. The suits were given to the Historical Society, though many refused to take them into storage. One curator quit on the spot after opening the trunk and finding the flowers still fragrant. Another refused to let the suits share space with war relics, stating they carried a weight that did not belong in history but in myth. Eventually, the suits were sealed in archival chambers beneath the county hall, labeled as textile artifacts. But even there, the temperature readings in that wing began to fluctuate. 2 workers developed nosebleeds while filing documents nearby. No official report was ever made, and still none of the suits had names, only dates, only initials. Only the spaces left by boys who never reached the altar, never touched holy water, never wore what had been made for them. In January of 1871, a Benton child lived to see the sunrise on his 4th day. His name was Ezra, the firstborn son of Ruth Benton, Claudine's granddaughter, and for the first time in almost 50 years a cry had echoed from the nursery on Hollow Creek Road. It was sharp and thin and jagged with life. The sound startled the hens. It made the dogs bark. It rang through the chimney flue and out into the snow-heavy trees like something that hadn't been allowed to exist until then. Ruth was young, 19. She had married a man from Smith Hollow who worked with rail steel and didn't believe in family rules. When the child was born, he demanded a midwife from town and baptized the infant himself in their wash basin before Claudine could arrive. He named the boy Ezra. He carved the name into the cradle's footboard with a dull knife and wrapped the baby in his army coat. Ruth did not speak against it, not then. Word spread fast. A firstborn son, alive, baptized, named. The church bell rang without instruction. The pastor offered a public blessing. And the townspeople began to believe that whatever darkness had hung over the Bentons for half a century had finally passed. That maybe it had only ever been Claudine. That maybe her grip had loosened. For 3 days, Ezra breathed and fed and fussed like any child. Neighbors came with hand-stitched gifts. Women left herbs on the fence post. The snow melted early around the cradle window. It felt like something had been broken. But on the 4th morning, the house was silent again. The child was gone. There was no cry, no body, no prints in the snow. Ruth was found on the parlor floor with her hands wrapped in gauze and blood soaking through to her wrists. She would not speak. She stared only at the hearth where the fire had been allowed to die. The cradle was overturned. The name carved into it had been scraped out with something metal, leaving deep grooves. The baby's blanket was folded and dry. Claudine sat at the kitchen table, her back straight, her hands clean. When the sheriff arrived, she offered him coffee and said the child had passed in the night and been laid to rest privately. No grave was shown. No doctor was called. Ruth was taken to her mother's home in the next county. Her bandages were changed daily. The skin beneath them had been peeled away in long strips, as though torn slowly. Not in a single injury, but over time. Her nails were gone. Her palms were raw and pink. She did not speak for weeks. When she finally did, she said only this: "He didn't cry on the 4th day." No one asked what that meant. The town no longer wanted to know. Later, a schoolboy hunting birds in the woods found a patch of earth behind the Benton orchard that steamed even in the frost. The ground was warm to the touch. When he pressed his ear to it, he swore he heard something breathing. His parents whipped him for lying, and he never returned to that field again. But others had their suspicions. The orchard rows had always grown in straight lines, until that year. One row shifted, A tree had been removed and replanted elsewhere. The soil beneath it darker than the rest, no marker, no name. Just the faint smell of formalin rising when the wind hit right. Some say Ezra lived until sunrise and then was taken. Others believe he died early, and Claudine punished the mother for allowing his name to be spoken. But one midwife claimed she saw Claudine walking through town the next day with a linen bundle pressed to her chest, not cradling it but clutching it too tightly. Not with sorrow, with insistence. Years later, Ruth was interviewed under an assumed name in a sanitarium 2 states away. She kept a wooden spoon under her pillow and spoke in riddles. When asked about her son, she pressed her bandaged hand against the wall and said, "The 4th day is too late." That's when the soul wakes up and starts to follow. Ezra Benton's name remained carved into the county birth ledger, but no death was ever recorded. His was the first and only firstborn son to be baptized. The Benton Ice House was the last structure standing after the main house collapsed from rot in the late winter of 1919. By then, the family was scattered, their name fading, but the land remained fenced and watched by no one. The old smokehouse had been sealed, the orchard overgrown, and the cellar doors bolted shut. But the ice house stood firm, its stone walls uncracked, its thick door locked with a rusted chain that no one ever seemed to cut. For decades it was ignored, a silent square of shadow in the trees behind the ruins. But children from Hollow Creek grew up with stories. They said the door moaned at night. They said the crows wouldn't land near it. And when the creek froze over, they dared each other to knock once and count to 3. In 1928, a boy named Davy Lambert did more than knock. He slid a crowbar from his father's barn and walked out to the ice house just after sundown. What he expected to find, mice, dust, maybe bones, was nothing like what answered. He pried the door loose with 2 hard pulls. The air that spilled out was not cold. It was warm, damp. It carried the sour tang of salt and iron. He stepped inside and saw the old wooden racks still intact, holding slabs of what should have been ice but weren't. They were darker, thicker, not clear. Each block sat in its own groove, untouched by frost, yet sweating like meat in the sun. Beneath them was a floor not of stone but slats of rotten wood, swollen and buckled. He stepped once, then again. The boards groaned, then something beneath them did too. Not echo, not creak, something living, a sound like lungs pulling in air after a long silence. Davy ran. He didn't tell his parents, but he told his friends, and within weeks enough children had whispered enough rumors that the new sheriff, Caleb Byrne, decided to break the lock and settle the fear once and for all. The town watched him go. No one followed. Byrne was practical, raised outside Hollow Creek, unaware of the old names and stories. He walked through the woods with a crowbar and a lantern. He forced the door open. He didn't return for 4 hours. When he did, he vomited on the steps of the general store and locked himself in his office for 3 days. His report was 1 sentence long. "Do not open again." But others remembered what the boy had said, and by spring the county sent 2 men to record what was inside. Their notes, sealed for decades, were later made public during a university's dark archives project. Inside the ice house were 13 blocks arranged in a perfect ring. Each was roughly the size of a child. They were not ice, but some kind of congealed translucent substance like resin mixed with bone ash. Floating in the center of each block was a shape, not full bodies but parts, not dismembered but unfinished. Some had torsos, some only heads. One was a rib cage wrapped in wire. The blocks bled slowly, a thin red trickle running down each side into the slats below. The room never froze even in February, even when temperatures dropped to 10 below. Beneath the slats was a pit, carved directly into the earth. Shallow at the edge, deep in the middle. The soil inside was black, rich, soft, like it had never frozen, like it had never known cold. In the center was a circle of ash, no larger than a cradle. Within it, pressed deep into the earth, were dozens of tiny impressions. Fingers, heels, the curve of a shoulder. As if something had moved there, or many things. The pit breathed faintly, the way some caves exhale in shifts. The air was damp, warm, slightly metallic. No one dug further. The sheriff ordered the door sealed with iron brackets and concrete poured across the entrance. The structure still stands, vine-covered and forgotten behind the ruins of the orchard. But even now, on the coldest nights, some say the frost recedes around that place, that the trees closest to it bloom too early, that animals avoid it in wide circles no matter how hungry. It was found beneath the parlor piano, inside a drawer no one knew existed, behind a false panel lined in copper. The floorboards had rotted, and when they lifted the piano to remove it from the collapsed Benton estate, one of the movers noticed a seam along the base, thin, smooth, hand-cut. They forced it open and pulled out a flat wooden box, lacquered black, wrapped twice in thread spun so tightly it had to be cut. Inside was a book, leather-bound, its cover cracked and dark with oil, stitched at the spine by hand. No title, no embossing. The pages inside were thick and yellow, and for the first 40 or 50 of them completely illegible. The handwriting curved and looped in a script that did not belong to any known language. Each character mirrored the next, repeating in precise rhythm. It looked less like writing and more like ritual. The book was sent to the university, where 3 separate linguists failed to find a root pattern. It wasn't Latin, Greek, or Slavic, but one student, a quiet postgraduate with an obsession for cipher systems, noticed something strange in the spacing. He realized it wasn't a language at all. It was a rhythm, a notation, like music, but not for sound, for time. Each page marked a series of events that had to happen at exact intervals, in exact order, under exact conditions. The symbols translated into actions, not ideas. When reordered and decoded, the meaning emerged. Not a journal, not scripture. A method, a sequence, a practice written down and preserved not to explain but to protect its structure from error. The title was revealed on the 6th page, Of the Children Who Must Not Awaken. The first chapter described what happened to the body in the first 72 hours of life. Not medically, not spiritually, but in terms of tethering. It claimed the soul was not truly inside the body until after the 3rd sunrise, that before then a child floated between 2 places, and that firstborn sons, always firstborns, carried the strongest link. If allowed to pass into the 4th day, they would be fully anchored, and if the shadow attached to them was not removed by then, it would root in and scream. The text did not describe the scream as audible. It described it as echoing through a place beneath silence, a scream that called something back, something not of this world but not entirely outside it either. The book detailed the exact tools required to prevent this: a knife made of bone rubbed with salt and tallow, a cradle of iron with knots tied in flax placed beneath a window facing north, a mirror to reflect only moonlight, never the child's breath, and most importantly, no name. To name the child before separation was considered a wound, a binding that made the process impossible. The act was called return, not death, not sacrifice, not murder, return. As if the child had simply arrived too early and had to be sent back before the door closed behind him. Each recorded case in the book followed the same pattern: a date, a weight, a time of birth, and a final note, returned before waking. No emotion, no narrative, just execution. There were 27 entries in all, each matched a month missing from the church ledger. The book never used the word mother. It called the one who performed the act the keeper. The father, if mentioned at all, was called the anchor, though most entries left that line blank. At the end of the book was a final section, shorter, messier, written in a different hand. It spoke of a failure, a child who breathed too soon, who saw his own reflection before the knife was warmed. The entry was stained, blurred with ink, but one phrase was clear. The echo has been heard. The rest was scratched out violently. Beneath that final page was something pressed into the leather, 3 faint indentations shaped like a child's fingertips. No one ever determined who authored the book. Claudine's name was never mentioned, though it was assumed she had either written it or protected it. Its existence proved that the practice was not delusion. It was legacy, inherited, maintained, and passed down with rules, timings, and tools too precise to be improvised. This was not a single act repeated blindly. It was a code, a belief, a blueprint for silence. In the spring of 1910, the orchard bloomed early, too early. The frost hadn't finished melting when the peach trees near the back fence flowered in full, thick clusters that smelled like wet sugar and iron. The Bentons hadn't lived on the land for years by then. The house was boarded, the smokehouse sealed, the chapel padlocked. But the soil had memory, and that orchard had always known what lay beneath it. On the morning of March 4th, a farmhand named Leary Cutts crossed the property without permission. He was chasing a runaway mule. What he found was not the animal, but a boy curled at the base of the largest tree, naked and breathing, with skin pale as milk and hair so white it reflected the gray sky above. His lips were blue, his nails were black, but his eyes were open. At first, Leary thought the boy had wandered from town. But there were no footprints in the wet soil, no sign of torn clothes or travel, just drag marks in the dirt, barely visible, as though he had been pulled up from the roots, not laid down from above. The boy was maybe 5, no bruises, no cuts, but cold, too cold, like something that had been kept under the ground too long. He didn't speak, he didn't blink. He only stared toward the chapel that stood 50 yards away, as if waiting for a sound no one else could hear. They named him Micah Benton because the name fit the ledger, and there had been a Micah once, a child recorded stillborn in 1905. No funeral, no baptism, no photo, just a name and a date crossed out twice. The age matched, the eyes didn't. Micah's eyes were silver, not blue, not gray. Silver, clouded in a way that looked like blindness but wasn't. He could see just fine. He just didn't look at people. He looked at corners, at walls, at knots in the wood. He was taken to the church infirmary and kept under supervision. On his second day there, he began to draw. Not pictures, not shapes a child should know, but symbols. Long curves with cross lines, tight spirals nested in threes, a looping grid that mirrored the cipher found in the Benton book. He scratched them into the floor with a spoon, into the dirt with his fingers, into the steam on the window pane, always the same, never repeated exactly. Like he was remembering them, not creating them. The nurse who cleaned his bed said he never cried, never asked for food. He drank water if given, but never reached for it. At night, he would sit up exactly 3 times, then lay flat again. When the priest came to bless him, Micah turned his head and hissed. Not like an animal, but like air leaking through teeth. No rage, no fear, just noise. The priest left and never returned. By the 7th day, the drawings had spread to the walls. Scraped with a metal button Micah had pulled from his own hospital gown. The shapes made the staff uneasy. One nurse refused to enter the room. Another wrote in her diary, "He looks like he knows something about me I've forgotten." The chapel next to the orchard reported power failures. Their bell rang at odd times. One evening it rang exactly 13 times at 2 a.m. There was no wind. No one had touched the rope. On the 10th day, Micah disappeared. No broken lock, no open window. His bed was made, his drawings scrubbed clean. Only the symbol carved deep into the underside of the wooden bed frame remained, an incomplete circle pierced by a downward line. The same mark burned into the wax seals of the preservation jars found decades earlier. The orchard tree where he was found bloomed late that year. One branch curled inward like a fist. Nothing ever grew on it again. The soil beneath it hardened, not dry but dense, like something inside had pushed up and been pressed back down. The last report on Micah Benton listed him as vanished during convalescence, but the priest's journal hidden in the church archives said something else. One line, written in shaking hand: he was not returned. He returned himself. The translated documents from the Benton book were sent to multiple scholars, each specializing in different disciplines: anthropology, theology, medical history, and folklore. What emerged was not a complete understanding, but a fractured glimpse into something neither ancient nor modern, neither fully symbolic nor fully surgical. It sat somewhere between religion and procedure, cruelty and belief. There were no prayers, no worship, no gods named. The ritual was not meant to glorify or summon, but to prevent. The instructions focused on interruption, on stopping something before it began. The goal was not to take a life. The goal was to make sure a life did not remain here. The process started on the third night, not the first. The documents were clear. Firstborn boys must be allowed to reach the 72nd hour. It was the threshold. Before then, the soul remained unanchored. Too soon, and the child would drift. Too late, and the child would root. The ritual's success relied on precise timing, temperature, and silence. The room must remain dark but not black. The child must not be named. No external voices were allowed to enter the space. The keeper, always the mother or a woman chosen to act in her place, had to fast for 3 days, eat only soaked grain and bone broth, and sleep beside the cradle without touching it. On the final night, the child was removed from the iron cradle and laid on a square of flax cloth stitched with 3 rings. The cloth had to be soaked first in a mix of honey and salt, then dried completely and burned at the edges until the scent shifted from sweet to sour. The keeper would then prick her own fingertip and measure the child's blood temperature against her own using a copper spoon. If the child's blood cooled too quickly, the ritual had failed. If it stayed warm, the keeper was to proceed. The document described a specific tone the child must hum during breath, something too soft to be heard unless the room held complete stillness. If that tone fell silent before the ritual was complete, the child had already rooted. The next step was called displacement. The child's shadow, now faint but present, was traced with black thread onto the flax cloth. This wasn't literal stitching. The thread was laid by hand in exact alignment with the child's outline, starting at the foot and ending at the crown. Once complete, a sacrament was placed at the center of the chest, a triangle of silk containing 3 items: a single clove, a pressed leaf, and a pinch of dust taken from beneath the keeper's bed. The silk was stitched closed with horsehair and tied with waxed string. The purpose of these ingredients was never explained, only that they bind the echo. Then came the final act. The child's head was turned to face north. A mirror, cracked but whole, was held over the child's stomach. If no reflection appeared, the keeper was to proceed. If the reflection returned eye contact, the ritual was to be abandoned immediately and the child silenced by other means. The document did not explain what those other means were. It only warned that failure would lead to something called second rooting, a term none of the scholars had seen before or since. The actual separation took place with a thin blade made from bird bone, sharpened to a fine curve. The blade was to be run just above the child's skin, never touching, only cutting through air and silence. 3 passes, once at the foot, once at the center, once above the crown. If done correctly, the flax would curl inward, and the thread outline would detach from the cloth as if lifting away from its own weave. The keeper was instructed to burn the cloth immediately and bury the ash beneath unplanted earth. No explanation was ever given for why the ritual existed, only that it had to be done, over and over, and only to the firstborn. The documents made no mention of girls, no mention of twins, just first sons, born healthy and whole, whose souls had arrived too loudly. The scholars who studied the documents couldn't agree on whether it was spiritual, delusional, or symbolic, but they agreed on one thing. Whoever wrote it had performed it many times. The instructions were too clear, too refined. It had been practiced, perfected. At the far edge of the Benton property, past the last crooked fence post and beyond the reach of the orchard's roots, there stands a stone chapel with no doorbell, no steeple, and no cross. It was built in 1854 by Claudine Benton's order, using stones quarried from beneath the family land. Each block was laid without blessing, without prayer, and without priest. No congregation ever gathered, no wedding was held, no hymns were sung. From the outside, the chapel looks more like a tomb than a house of faith. There are no windows, no light ever passed through it. Just a single iron door rusted at the hinges, locked from the inside and chained from the out. What survives inside is worse than abandonment. Along the inner walls, etched into the very stone, are carvings of crying infants, not held, not comforted, just faces stretched in silence, mouths open in soundless grief. Each carving is placed low near the floor, where a small child might crawl past and see its own image weeping back. Above them are rows of copper plaques, not marked by names, only by numbers. Dates, months, years, each corresponding to a ledger entry that was never made. 27 in total, each one matching a child the Bentons never spoke of. At the center of the chapel lies a stone cradle carved from a single piece of black slate. No straw, no cushion, just a hollow where something once rested and was not meant to return. The room smells faintly of salt and ash, as if the rituals done elsewhere left a permanent mark in the air. To this day, no one has removed the plaques. The state called it a historic structure and sealed it, but the carvings remain, still crying, still watching, waiting for a name that never comes. In 1956, a construction crew digging the foundation for a new grain storage facility struck something too firm, too smooth, too deliberately placed. Beneath just 12 inches of soil arranged in a wide crescent at the edge of what had once been the Benton orchard were 27 small graves. No markers, no stones, just careful depressions in the earth, packed tight with a chalk-like compound that resisted decay. Each pit held a child, not skeletons, bodies perfectly preserved. The skin was pale, waxy, nearly translucent, the eyes sealed shut with resin, each one laid in the fetal position, knees to chest, hands crossed, lips sewn closed with waxed black thread in 3 neat stitches. The thread didn't fray, it held. The coroner refused to issue a standard death certificate. He wrote a single line in his report: "Not buried." Stored, the bodies were moved to state custody, but none were claimed. DNA testing decades later confirmed a shared bloodline. Benton. No records existed for their births. No photographs, no names. Since that day, no Benton descendant has carried a firstborn son to term. Miscarriages, stillbirths. Silence. It's as though whatever was practiced had finally finished its cycle, not broken, just completed.